Good evening, and welcome to Footnotes and Folly. Tonight, something a little different and a little closer to home. We are not opening one book by one author, we are opening a whole shelf of them, written across 2,500 years, all circling a single enormous question that very nearly every adult human eventually has to answer for themselves. What, exactly, is a marriage, and who is supposed to do what inside it? Because here is the thing nobody tells you, there has never been one answer. The roles we think of as natural, eternal, simply the way things are, great many intelligent people in a great many centuries would have found utterly strange. So tonight we are going to lay the options out on the table fairly, each in its own best clothes, and then, at the end, I am going to do something I almost never do. I am going to hand the verdict to you. We will make 4 stops. First, ancient Greece and Rome, where the philosophers built the household like a small kingdom, with the husband ruling outside and the wife sovereign within. Then the scripture and the moral codes that gave the marriage of the West its sacred shape, submission and sacrifice, headship and honor, set down with a seriousness that still echoes in a great many homes tonight. Then the Victorian parlor, where the wife became the angel and the commander of an entire domestic world, exalted and, some came to feel, beautifully imprisoned. And finally the Revolt, when a line of fierce and brilliant women looked at the whole arrangement and asked, with devastating politeness, whether it had ever really been fair at all. Every one of these ages was certain, utterly certain, that its way was simply how things are. You have the rare luxury of reading all 4 menus before you order. So let us begin, and try to leave our own century's certainties at the door. Our first model of marriage is also our oldest, and it comes from classical Greece, around the 4th century before Christ, the world of Athens, of Socrates and the philosophers. And the first thing to understand is that to these men, a marriage was not mainly about love, or even mainly about children. It was an economic institution, the founding of a household, an oikos, a small working estate that had to feed and clothe and perpetuate itself. And like any enterprise, it needed a division of labor. What the Greeks worked out, and wrote down with great care, was a model we might call the partnership of separate spheres. The husband rules the world outside the front door, the wife rules everything within it. And before you decide that sounds simply like a man giving himself the bigger half, listen to how seriously they took the wife's half, because it is not quite what you expect.
Our guide here is a writer named Xenophon, a soldier and gentleman, farmer who sat down in a dialogue called The Economist, meaning the science of running a household, the fullest account we have. His spokesman is a model husband called Oeconomicus, who describes his own marriage with disarming frankness. His wife, he says, was not quite 15 years old when she came to him, and had been raised in the custom of the time, to see and hear and ask as little as possible. Her entire education was knowing how to take wool and make a dress. So Oeconomicus sets out, quite literally, to train her into a partner to teach a child bride how to command a household. And the heart of his teaching is an image so charming that it has outlived everything else in the book. He tells her she is to be the queen of the hive. Think of the leader of the bees. She stays within the hive and suffers none of the other bees to be idle. Those whose work lies outside she sends forth to their labor, and all that each brings in she receives and stores against the day of need, and shares it out in justice when the time comes. She presides over the weaving of the comb, and under her watch the young are reared. You will need in the very same way to stay within and to be the queen of all our house. It is, you have to admit, a rather glorious job description. The wife is not a servant in this picture. She is the sovereign of the entire interior economy, the stores, the staff, the accounts, the manufacture, the raising of the next generation. Now lift your eyes from the single household to the theory of the whole thing, and you arrive at Aristotle, writing a generation later. In the first book of his Politics, Aristotle makes the household the very seat of the state, the basic cell from which villages and cities grow, and he is careful, more careful than people remember, about what kind of rule a husband holds. He insists the husband does not rule his wife as a master rules a slave. He rules her, Aristotle says, as a statesman rules free fellow citizens. The wife is a free person. The catch, and it is a large one, is that this is the one constitution that never holds an election. For among citizens, Aristotle notes, office rotates, but here it does not, because, he declares, the male is by nature the superior. Nature, you will notice, had a remarkable habit of agreeing with the gentleman writing the books. Move forward 400 years and across to Rome, and the model softens into something almost tender. Plutarch, the great Greek essayist writing under the Roman Empire around the year 100, left us a wedding present in prose called The Conjugal Precepts, and at its best, it is genuinely warm. The husband, Plutarch writes, ought to rule his wife not as a master does a piece of property, but as the soul governs the body by sympathy and goodwill, and never as a tyrant. That is a real advance. That is a marriage of feeling. And yet, in the very same essay, the older world shows through. The good wife, Plutarch advises, should have no friends of her own, but only her husband's. She should worship only her husband's gods and shut the door on any of her own. She should be seen chiefly at her husband's side, and stay quietly at home whenever he is away, like the moon that shines only with the sun. The ideal had grown kinder. It had not yet grown equal.
So there is our first model, laid out fairly, the household of separate spheres. and we should be honest about both sides of it. On the credit side, it is a genuine partnership with genuine dignity. The wife is no drudge but the acknowledged ruler of a whole domain, an economic equal whose work is essential and respected, and in Plutarch's version she is loved and ruled gently. A great many people across history have wanted exactly this, and a great many want it still. On the debit side, she came to it at 14, and taught on purpose. She could not vote in her own marriage, and she was to have no friends, no gods, and no public life that were her very own. It is a model that offers a woman a kingdom, on the single condition that she never leave it. Hold that thought, the kingdom and the condition, because in our next stop that same household is about to be lifted up and made holy. The Greeks built the structure. Scripture is about to consecrate it. Our second model takes that same household, the man at its head, the woman within it, and does something the Greeks never quite did. It makes it holy. This is the marriage of Scripture, and I want to be plain about how I will handle it, because for a great many of you watching tonight this is not ancient history at all, it is the living shape of your own home and your own vows. So I will read it straight and with respect. These texts have held marriages together for 2,000 years, and they are loved tonight by more people than any philosopher ever reached. What I will not do is let anyone quote them with half the words missing, because that, as we shall see, is exactly how the trouble usually starts.
The core of it sits in a letter of the Apostle Paul to the Ephesians in the 1st century after Christ. And everybody knows the first line. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife. There it is, the most quoted, and the most weaponized sentence in the whole history of marriage. But read on, because Paul does not stop there, and the second half is far heavier than the first. Husbands, he goes on, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. The wife is asked to submit. The husband is asked to love her the way Christ loved the church, which is to say, to the point of laying his own life down for her. And the letter to the Colossians adds the line men forget even faster: husbands, love your wives, and be not bitter against them. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. Now here is where Pemberton gets a little sharp, and notice carefully who he is getting sharp with. It is not with Paul, and not with anyone who holds this faith. It is with the centuries of people who learned to read the passage with a pair of scissors. For a very long time, in a great many pulpits and at a great many kitchen tables, the words wives, submit were quoted loudly and often, while the far more demanding command to the husband, love her as Christ gave himself, love her as your own flesh, be not bitter, somehow went quiet. That is not the text's fault. The text binds both parties and lays the heavier yoke on the man. It asks the wife to follow and the husband to sacrifice himself entirely. So whenever you hear only the wife's half of that bargain read aloud, you may be quite sure that someone has been at the page with the scissors, and it usually was not a woman. And then, older than Paul by centuries, from the Hebrew Scriptures comes a passage that quietly demolishes the meek little housewife cartoon altogether, the woman of valor in the last chapter of the book of Proverbs. Listen to who this most praised of all wives actually is. Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies. She seeketh wool and flax, and worketh willingly with her hands. She is like the merchant ships, she bringeth her food from afar. She considereth a field, and buyeth it, with the fruit of her hands she planteth a vineyard. She maketh fine linen, and selleth it. Strength and honor are her clothing. She openeth her mouth with wisdom. This is not a shrinking ornament who waits at home. She is a manufacturer, a landowner, an importer, a trader. Her lamp burns past midnight over her accounts, and her husband's single recorded job in the whole passage is to sit at the gate and praise her. The ideal woman of the Bible runs a business empire.
So weigh this second model honestly, as we promised to weigh them all. The covenant of headship and sacrifice is not a contract, it is a sacred bond, two becoming one flesh, bound not by law but by vows made before God. At its truest it asks enormous things of both, the wife to honor, yes, but the husband to spend his whole self in love, to lead by serving and not by lording. It has carried families through poverty and war and grief for 20 centuries, and millions tonight would not trade it for anything this channel could offer them, and that deserves real respect, not a smirk. Its contested edges are equally real. The word head, however gently meant, still names one party the leader, and the gentle phrase keepers at home was used, long after the apostles, to bolt the front door on women who wanted a life beyond it. Hold both the sacred covenant and the bolted door, because we are about to watch this holy household step out of the church and into the Victorian parlour, where it puts on its finest dress, and very nearly becomes a cage of velvet. Now we jump the centuries to the 1800s, to Victorian Britain and America, to the world of the middle-class home, the parlour and the servant's bell. And the sacred household of Scripture arrives here wearing its very finest dress. The age gave it a doctrine, the doctrine of the two spheres. The husband goes out into the rough public world of work and money and politics. The wife reigns over the home, which is now reimagined as something almost wholly a sanctuary of morality and peace, with the wife as its presiding spirit. They called her the angel of the house. And here is the twist most people miss. A great many of the people who built this ideal and defended it most fiercely were women, proud, formidable women who saw in it not a cage but a throne.
Meet the most famous of them, Mrs. Isabella Beeton, whose enormous book of household management was a bestseller in Victorian Britain and sat in hundreds of thousands of homes. And how does she open it? With a quotation from Proverbs, our woman of valor again, threading straight through from the last chapter, and then with one of the great opening lines of domestic literature. As with the commander of an army, she writes, or the leader of any enterprise, so is it with the mistress of a house. Read that again. He is not describing a meek little homemaker dusting the mantle. He is describing a commanding officer. In Beeton's hands, the wife is the chief executive of a complex operations staff, supply, accounts, hospitality, logistics, the moral tone of the entire establishment flowing down from her. The Victorians did not think they were shrinking the wife. They thought they were promoting her to general. As with the commander of an army or the leader of any enterprise, so is it with the mistress of a house. Her spirit will be seen through the whole establishment, and just in proportion as she performs her duties intelligently and thoroughly, so will her domestics follow in her path. Across the Atlantic, the American writer Catharine Beecher gave the same ideal its moral backbone. In her treatise on domestic economy, she insisted that running a home was a profession arduous, skill, and sacred for which young women ought to be trained as seriously as any man for a trade. And she made the boldest version of the separates, Fear's argument, that in a free society somebody must lead and somebody must yield, and that women, having gracefully yielded the public world of votes and offices to men, ruled in exchange the deeper world, the moral and domestic one, where character itself is formed. The hand that rocked the cradle on this view shaped the nation more surely than any senator. It was, in its strange way, a kind of feminism of the hearth. An argument that women were not lesser, but sovereign in the sphere that mattered most. And you can feel the appeal of it. For the right woman in the right home, this was a real and satisfying empire, prestige, authority, usefulness, a whole domain genuinely her own. A Pemberton must point at the thing glinting in the velvet. The very height of the pedestal was what kept her on it. Calling the home a sacred sphere, and the wife its angel, was also a remarkably effective way of explaining why she could not have the other spheres, could not own property freely, or enter the professions, or stand for office, or, in most of the world, so much as cast a vote. The angel was adored, genuinely adored. She was also, with great tenderness and beautiful furniture, locked in. And by the end of the century, a number of extremely intelligent angels had begun, very quietly, to examine the lock.
So, the third model weighed as fairly as the rest, domestic sovereignty, the honored wife as queen of a sacred home. Its goods are not nothing, they are, in fact, considerable. Real authority, real respect, real skill honored as a profession, a sphere of one's own, and the deep satisfaction that has always come from making a home a good place to be. Plenty of women chose it gladly then, plenty would choose it gladly now, and there is not a thing wrong with them for it. Its cost was simply this: it was offered as the only sphere a woman might have, and the adoration came with walls. Which brings us, at last, to the fourth stop on our tour, and to the women who looked at the beautiful cage, thanked everyone politely for the flowers, and picked up a file. The revolt is about to begin. And so to our fourth and final stop, which runs roughly from the 1830s to the 1920s, in America and Britain, the revolt. A line of fierce, brilliant, mostly very respectable women looked at the whole inheritance we have just toured, the Greek spheres, the sacred submission, the velvet pedestal, and began, with devastating politeness, to take it apart. And let me clear away the cartoon first. Most of these women were not enemies of marriage. A good many were happily married themselves. What they were against was being owned, the idea that a wife's role was fixed for her, by nature or by God or by Mrs. Beeton, with no say of her own. They came at it with four weapons: moral arguments, scripture, cold economics, and the sharpest one of all, fiction.
It opens in 1838 with an American abolitionist named Sarah Grimke. He had spent years arguing that no human being should own another, and then she turned the very same logic on the marriage of her own time, and on the very same scriptures everyone quoted to justify it. Her demand was not for special treatment. It was, pointedly, for a great deal less of the special treatment women already got: the pedestal, the protection, the being placed gently out of the way. She asked only to be allowed to stand up. I ask no favors for my sex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks, and permit us to stand upright on that ground which God designed us to occupy. Notice that Grimke argued from Scripture, not against it, and that points to the revolt's boldest front. In 1895, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and a committee of women published the Woman's Bible, and went straight for the root. The very verses we read back in our second stop, the ones used for 18 centuries to settle the question. The line in Genesis, "Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee," had been read as God's standing order for all wives forever. Stanton's circle read it differently, as a description of a fallen and broken world, a grief to be repaired, not a command to be obeyed. Now you may hold the traditional reading. Millions faithfully do, and this channel will not tell you that you are wrong. But that is exactly the point Stanton forced into the open, that it was a reading. That somewhere behind the eternal rule stood a human interpreter, choosing. Then comes the coldest and perhaps the deepest cut, from Charlotte Perkins Gilman in 1898. Forget feelings for a moment, she said. Follow the money. We are, she observed, very nearly the only species on earth in which an entire sex lives in a state of economic dependence upon the other, in which the wife must be fed by the husband in exchange for the work and the person she gives him. And no marriage resting on that foundation, however loving, can be a marriage of true equals, because one party can always in the end withhold the bread. Gilman drove it home in a short, terrifying story called The Yellow Wallpaper, about a loving husband, a doctor, no less, who confines his wife and forbids her to work or write, entirely for her own good, and quietly destroys her mind. He does not believe I am sick, the trapped wife tells us, and what can one do? It is the gentle, well-meant cage of the third stop, drawn from the inside in the dark. And at the far, radical edge of the revolt stood Emma Goldman, who in 1910 refused the whole institution outright. Marriage and love, she wrote, have nothing in common. They are as far apart as the poles. Marriage, to Goldman, was not a sacred covenant at all, but a cold transaction, primarily an economic arrangement, an insurance pact in which a woman pays the premium not in money but with her name, her privacy, her self-respect, her very life, until death do them part. It is the harshest verdict anyone on our whole tour delivers, and most people then and now would say it goes much too far. But it belongs on the table in full, because a complete menu has to include the option of walking out of the restaurant altogether.
So what did the revolt actually achieve? It did not, in the end, abolish marriage. Goldman lost that argument, and marriage is still here. What it did was add a new dish to the menu, and a powerful one, the marriage of equals. Two people, partners by choice and not by rank, dividing their life by agreement and temperament rather than by rule written before either was born, the wife free to hold the purse, the profession, the vote, and her own gods and friends, the very things Plutarch had quietly forbidden 2,000 years before. And alongside it, the revolt left a second, starker option on the table: no marriage at all. The great achievement of these women was not to tell you which to pick. It was to prove, once and for all, that it was a pick, that the roles we had been told were simply nature were, every one of them, a choice that somebody made. Which leaves only the last and most important question of the evening. The choosing. And that one is yours. Let us lay the whole menu on the table, then, one last time, fairly. 5 ways to be married, gathered across 2,500 years. First, the Greek household of separate spheres, husband without, wife sovereign within, a working partnership of divided labor. Second, the sacred covenant, headship and submission, bound to sacrificial love, two made one flesh under God. Third, the Victorian domestic throne, the wife as honored angel and commander of the home. Fourth, the partnership of equals, two free people dividing their life by agreement, not by rule. And fifth, at the edge, the refusal of the whole institution. Each of these has been lived and loved and defended by intelligent people. Each gave something real, and each asked a price. Not one of them was ever simply how things are. And that is the single thing I most want you to carry away tonight. Every age we visited was certain, serenely, absolutely certain, that its own arrangement was nature itself, ordained and obvious and beyond question. They cannot all have been right, which means that not one of them was merely nature. It was always, underneath, a choice made for most people in history by their parents, their priest, their poverty, or their century, and never by themselves. You are among the first human beings who get to read all 5 menus before you order. That is an astonishing privilege, and it comes with the one duty privilege always brings, to choose on purpose. I will not tell you which to pick, that truly is not my place, and it was never the point. A marriage of strict and sacred order, freely and lovingly chosen, can be a magnificent thing, so can a partnership of perfect equals, so, for some, can a life with no marriage in it at all. The only bad choice on this entire menu is the one nobody actually makes, the role you slide into in the dark, never once suspecting there was a card to turn over. So turn it over. Read all of it. Talk to the person you have chosen, or will, and decide together out loud, with your eyes open, what kind of marriage yours is going to be, and then build that one on purpose, and let it be truly yours, and not merely the one you happen to inherit. That is the whole of tonight's advice, and the only verdict I will offer, that the choosing is yours, and that it is worth doing well. Thank you, as ever, for spending this long evening in the library with me, and for thinking honestly about a question that nearly every life eventually asks. I am Pemberton. The lamp is low, the shelf is full, and the rest, for once, is entirely up to you. Good night.